Alright guys, so I decided to make a video to basically sum up all the important things that I tried to communicate last Wednesday. I felt like the lecture was very dense and contained a lot of specific details that at one point I felt lost and you guys felt lost. So I hope the video will help you guys touch base and get grounded with the material before I move on to talking about eating physiology next Wednesday and Thursday. So last Wednesday we talked about cell communication, and I brought up two important ways that cell can communicate with one another. One of the ways that cell can communicate, can relay the information from other cells, is through gated channels. And I also mentioned that there are two types of gated channels. There is the chemically gated channels, and there's the electrically gated channels. And I chose this specific example, this diagram that shows the communication between a neuron and a muscle cell in muscle contraction, because this specific example contained the chemically gated channels and also electrically gated channels. So when the neuron tries to tell the muscle cell to contract, try to communicate with this muscle cell, most of the time it will secrete a chemical signal that can then be picked up by the muscle cell. And these receptor proteins that receive acetylcholine, these little chemicals, are called the chemically gated channels. And remember that these chemically gated channels are only activated if there is a binding of an extracellular signal. In this case, it's acetylcholine. And so if you imagine that when acetylcholine lands onto this receptor protein, it will open up. This receptor protein will open up and let sodium ions flow from the outside of the cell into the inside of the cell through these channels. And that influx of sodium will cause an electrical change in the muscle cell. Specifically, it will cause the muscle cell, the inside of the muscle cell, to be more positive relative to the outside of the cell. And this change in the electrical environment in the muscle cell will activate electrically gated channels. And there are these calcium channels. So in contrast to this chemically gated channels, these calcium channels are electrically gated. That means they only respond to a change in the electrical environment inside a muscle cell, and that they don't respond to a binding of acetylcholine, for example, or other chemicals. They only respond to a change in electrical environment inside of the cell. And these calcium channels, these calcium electrically gated channels, are not the only electrically gated channels in this example. If you remember the snare complex in relationship to related to calcium, these calcium channels are not the only electrically gated channels in this case. If you remember the snare complex and calcium in the role of exocytosis, there are also electrically gated channels right here that are calcium channels. So they're a lot similar to these calcium channels in that they respond to an electrical change inside of the neuron. So if there is a more positive environment in this neuron, this electrical change will activate these calcium channels, these calcium electrically gated channels, to be activated to open up and let calcium to flow into the neuron. And remember that calcium will activate the snare complex, and the snare complex will fuse the membrane of the vesicle with the membrane of the neuron, and that will induce exocytosis of the vesicle and release of acetylcholine to the synaptic cleft. So in general, this specific example shows that the muscle cell can relay the information from the the neuron by these chemically gated channels that receive acetylcholine, or these electrically gated channels right there and right here.